Welcome to the Bio Insights, where science comes alive.
Today, we're diving headfirst into the unseen biological world all around us. We're going to figure out exactly what it takes for bacteria to not just survive, but absolutely thrive and multiply. It all comes down to finding what microbiologists like to call the Microbial Goldilocks Zone. To set the stage here, we really need to wrap our heads around the, well, frankly, terrifying math of these microbes. 500,000. That is exactly how many bacteria can fit on the mere point of a pin. I mean, think about that for a second. It really puts into perspective just how invisible this whole world is to the naked eye. And to see how that tiny scale translates to human health, consider this. It only takes about 1,000 of certain disease-causing bacteria to actually make a human being sick. So, doing the math, that means a single pinpoint of bacteria could theoretically make 500 people ill. That becomes a massive problem if they're allowed to just multiply unchecked. To get a handle on this, we're going to break this complex microbial universe down into 5 digestible chapters. We'll look at the math of multiplication, the microbial Goldilocks zone, temperature and oxygen demands, pH, pressure and moisture, and finally controlling the invisible world. So let's kick things off with Chapter 1, the math of multiplication, and how a small problem becomes massive quickly. Let's look at the actual mechanism of how bacteria increase their population. Because, they don't do it the way we might think. It's done through a process called binary fission. Basically, one bacterial cell just splits into 2, then those 2 into 4, 4 into 8, and so on. It results in this super rapid exponential population growth. The key takeaway here is that growth in microbiology doesn't actually mean an individual cell gets bigger. It's entirely about cell multiplication through this splitting process. Let's see what that looks like in real time, looking at the math of what we call generation time. Picture a colony of just 5 bacteria that splits every 15 minutes. At 30 minutes, you've got 20 bacteria. In an hour, you're at 80. By hour 2, that tiny initial colony of 5 has exploded into 1,280 bacteria. Under the right circumstances, a population can absolutely skyrocket. Moving right along to Section 2, the Microbial Goldilocks Zone, or seeking the perfect environmental conditions. Now, thankfully, this kind of rapid growth isn't just guaranteed. Bacteria are literally like Goldilocks. They need their surrounding environment to be just right. To remember these pretty strict environmental rules, we use a really handy acronym, FAT, Tom. That stands for food, acidity, time, temperature, oxygen, and moisture. These are the exact physical and chemical factors bacteria desperately need to build their cellular components, crank out energy, and basically carry out their metabolic activities. That brings us to Section 3, temperature and oxygen demands. We're going from freezing cold to extreme heat and looking at the oxygen paradox. All right, let's dive a bit deeper into 2 of the biggest players in that Fat Tom toolkit. Temperature and oxygen. Every single bacterial species has a minimum, maximum, and optimum temperature for survival. It perfectly categorizes them based on their environment. For instance, psychrophils thrive in the freezing Arctic, while thermophils and hyperthermophiles absolutely love boiling hot springs. But take a look at the mesophile bucket, right there between 20 and 40 degrees Celsius. Most human pathogens fall perfectly into this category, mostly because our 37-degree body temperature is their absolute perfect Goldilocks zone. So temperature is highly specific, right? But what about air? We naturally just assume that all living things need air to breathe and survive. But when we're talking about the unseen microbial world, we actually have to pause and ask a pretty surprising question. Is oxygen always essential for life? Well, the answer is a resounding no. Comparing these 2 groups reveals a pretty wild biological reality. Over on the left, we've got obligate aerobes, like the bacteria that causes tuberculosis. They absolutely need oxygen to survive. But on the right, look at the obligate anaerobes, like the bug that causes botulism. Not only do they not need oxygen, but the presence of oxygen is literally toxic to them. That's exactly why you find them hiding out deep inside tissues or in entirely oxygen-free zones. You might be wondering, how on earth can oxygen be toxic? Well, it all comes down to what's known as the oxygen paradox. See, oxygen metabolism naturally creates highly toxic byproducts called reactive oxygen species, things like hydrogen peroxide and superoxide ions. So the really crucial point here is that aerobic bacteria can only survive oxygen because they possess special defensive enzymes like superoxide dismutase and catalase that neutralize those toxins. Obligate anaerobes, they completely lack these chemical shields, meaning if they're exposed to air, their cellular molecules are literally torn apart by oxygen radicals.
Let's roll right into Section 4, pH, pressure, and moisture, surviving extreme chemical and physical forces. When we look at the chemical and physical forces that dictate bacterial survival, we find that, much like temperature, bacteria are incredibly sensitive to the acidity of their environment. Extreme acidic or alkaline conditions will just denature their enzymes and completely shut down their metabolism. Acidophiles love acidic environments, like yogurt. Alkalophiles thrive in basic environments. And neutrophiles? They prefer that middle ground, which, surprise, surprise, perfectly aligns with the pH of the human body, making it a great home for most of our known pathogens. Now, beyond acidity, moisture is an absolute must-have as a transport medium inside the bacterial cell. But it's not just about getting wet. Bacteria are in a constant battle with osmotic pressure to keep their water levels perfectly balanced. If you drop them into a highly concentrated environment full of salt or sugar, the water will literally be sucked right out of them through osmosis, which halts their growth right in its tracks. And these intense forces really highlight the incredible survivalist adaptations of some specialized microbes. Halophiles, for example, have evolved to thrive in highly concentrated salt water, up to 25% sodium chloride, like in the Dead Sea. Xerophiles can survive incredibly dry environments, and barophiles, they grow rapidly under extreme deep ocean pressure, over 10,000 meters deep. They use these incredible internal adaptations to thrive in places where a normal cell would instantly shrink, dry out, or just be totally crushed. Even the light around them plays a huge physical role. While some bacteria do need light to grow, exposure to UV radiation is incredibly dangerous for most of them. When non-ionizing UV radiation hits the bacteria, it causes lethal physical mutations to the microbial DNA, creating these things called thymine dimers. It physically jams up their DNA replication, stops their metabolism, and ultimately causes cell death. That makes UV light a super powerful weapon against bacterial growth. Which leads us nicely into Section 5, controlling the invisible world, applying the Goldilocks principle to everyday life. So how do we take all of this complex microbiology and actually apply the Goldilocks principle to our everyday lives? Simple. We intentionally weaponize those fat tom conditions against them. By making the environment completely unfavorable, we actively prevent foodborne illnesses and infections. Think about it. Refrigeration safely drops the temperature below the mesophyll optimum, practically freezing their enzyme activity. Pickling with vinegar drops the pH way out of their safe zone. Curing meats with salt or sugar drastically cranks up that osmotic pressure, forcefully dehydrating their cells. And everyday disinfectants? They cause the bacterial cell walls to literally break open. We are basically using their own environmental needs against them. Which leaves us with one final, pretty provocative thought. When you consider their incredible, ancient ability to adapt to almost any extreme on Earth, from freezing ice to crushing depths to toxic environments, are we really controlling them? Or are we just living in their world? I mean, who is truly adapting to whom? It's definitely a fascinating question to ponder. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope it gave you a brilliant new perspective on the invisible world around us.